Hello everyone. The topic of our discussion today is migration. And here are the objectives of today's learning. We shall talk about global migration, where we will present some sort of an overview and also the current situation, the trends over time, and we shall also present the migration scenario in India. Then we shall go and discuss about migration and population growth. What is the link between these two? Then we'll move on to the last part of our discussion where we will link migration, population growth, and economic development. What you see on your screen is called the Google Books Ngram. What we show here is that over the time, which is measured on the horizontal axis, the proportion or the percentage of times the word migration has appeared on a title of a book or in a title of a book written in English has really increased. That is the percentage we are showing here. Now remember, it is just to give an indication of the importance of the word migration in the titles of different books written in English language. And you can clearly see that there is a rising importance over the 20th century. However, towards the later part of 20th century, there is some sort of a stability in that proportion, and there's ups and downs. And only recently, again, you see there is an upward trend. So it kind of is indicative of the fact that there is some sort of increasing interest, perhaps, in issues of migration. Now, let's not confuse. This is not just migration related to economic matters alone. This could be any kind of migration. This is just indicative of that. Okay. Now, we all know that migration is a serious economic as well as socio-political concern. And in India, for example, we have seen in the post-COVID and post-lockdown scenario how important this issue is. We have seen the issue of migrants crisis and so on. And migration has serious implications for population growth in some cases. And the relationship between migration, population growth, and economic development is kind of complicated. Okay, now we move on to the first segment of our presentation, of our discussion, where we talk about the global migration. What is the situation of global migration? What you see on your screen is that we are measuring number of migrants in millions, and it is increasing over the years. But that is kind of expected. With population growth, the total number of migrants will also increase. But what is also noteworthy in this particular graph is we have presented the percentage of total migrants in total global population. So percentage of migrants in the global population. So even that is increasing, as you can see. So it is not just the total number of migrants is increasing, it's also the share of migrants in the total global population is increasing, which implies basically the rate at which the number of migrants is rising is relatively more than the rate at which the global population is rising. And this is some sort of overview over the last 2 decades, let's say, that you see between 2000 and 2020. Initially, there was 150 million migrants globally. In 2020, we have about 272 million migrants globally. So these are the estimated number of international migrants. What you also see here is that the estimated proportion of world population who are migrants, that has also increased. What has not changed much is the estimated proportion of female international migrants. Here is an important graph for you. Where are these people going? So many migrants. Which countries they are actually heading to? If you compare the trends between 2000 and 2020, you can clearly see that what we're measuring on the y-axis is number of migrants in millions again, and that is increasing steadily for the high-income countries. And the level is also much higher than the other kinds of countries. Now these classifications are a World Bank classification of different income categories countries. Like you have high-income countries, you have upper middle-income countries, you have lower middle-income countries, and you have low-income countries. In other words, as the title suggests, what we are presenting here is the number of international migrants by World Bank income group at destination between 2000 and 2020. Clearly, what you see here is that the destination is relatively more in favor of the high-income countries as expected. So high-income countries, in a way, becomes a more preferred destination for the migrants, international migrants, and the trend is actually upward. And the level is also much higher compared to the other kinds of countries. Here, what we are presenting in the next slide is the change in number of international migrants. Again, the countries are classified by World Bank into different income groups. And this we are talking about the destination. Now you see, between 2000 and 2020, in case of the high income group, the total change is way higher than what is the scenario for other kinds of countries like upper middle income countries, lower middle income countries, low income countries. The blue bar is representing the total change. Here is an important factor. Look at the gray bar. That is the change in migration, number of migrants due to refugees and asylum seekers. So what you see, while the total change is much higher in case of high-income countries, when it comes to due to refugees and asylum seekers, where are they mostly heading towards? Upper middle-income countries. This is a significant difference between these two kinds of countries and these two types of migration. So perhaps if we segregate out from all migrants, specifically those who are kind of refugees and asylum seekers, they are relatively moving more towards upper middle income countries. Okay, this graph actually presents a proportionate distribution of international migrants by region and country or area of destination. In a way, this is a more global picture, and you can clearly see from this particular graph which part of the world is absorbing what proportion of total international migrants. Clearly, as you can see, Europe is absorbing relatively much bigger proportion of the total international migrants. This is a very helpful graph to kind of show you the distribution of international migrants. And this is the figure for the year 2020. Now it's your turn. Think about this. Which part of the world seems to be absorbing a relatively higher proportion of international migration? So we raised a question. Which part of the world seems to be absorbing a relatively higher proportion of international migration? And we have discussed, you can go back to the chart where we have shown, and of course it seems to be Europe. So after this overview of global scenario of global migration, let's look at what is happening in India. Now I'm guessing most of you can recollect this photo, and this came during our post-lockdown, post-COVID situation. Now these are all migrants waiting at the station to go back home. What is the current scenario of migration in India? As we mentioned earlier, that COVID-19 has actually made the migrant crisis evident. Well, it does not mean that the crisis of migrants had not been there before COVID-19. The situation just made it worse, and it has made it explicit. Now there is a caveat that we need to add here. All the migrants are not similar. So there would be migrants who are formal labor, and there would be migrants who are informal labor. So when the word migrant crisis comes to our mind, let's be clear here, let's be careful also that we are mostly referring to the informal labor in our country. All these hundreds of people, thousands of people you have seen in television during COVID-19 or post-lockdown era who have been returning home, these are mostly the precarious conditions of them, actually referring to the situation of the informal employment in our country. So most of these migrants are in the informal sector. So we need to categorize the migrants also in terms of whether they are formal employees or they're informal employees, informal labor. Now, what is the current scenario therefore? We are presenting the current scenario based on a periodic labor force survey conducting over the period July 2020 and June 2021. We have given all the details of the survey, and also the links are made available. And you can actually access the actual report that we are using here. So let's look at this. Here we are presenting migration rate. And what we have done is we have categorized numbers into 3 different boxes, as you can see, by sex and also overall. So we have female migrants, we have male migrants, and we have person. By person mean we are ignoring whether they are male or female. On the horizontal axis, we have specified the sectors. So what does it show? Here we are representing the migration rate. So if we take all the rural female, out of them 48% would be migrants, in the sense that the place of enumeration differs from their usual place of residence. Similarly, if we take all the urban female, then about 47.8% of them would be migrants. So what we see here, that be it rural sector, be it urban sector, among the female population, almost about 50% of them are actually migrant. And also, there is not much difference between whether they are in the rural sector or whether they are in the urban sector. That is not the case when it comes to male population. If you take the rural male population, of the total rural male population, you'll find about 5.9% are actually migrants. But that ratio, that rate is much higher when you take the urban male population. So if you take all the urban male population, then you'll see about 22.5% of them are actually migrants. So what are the main things that we are seeing here? That the story of migration in India is predominantly by its story of women migrants. And the migration rate actually is much higher among women, be it rural, be it urban sector, and there's not much of difference, sectoral difference in this regard. When it comes to the male migrants, there is sectoral difference, and the rate of migration is also lower as compared to the female migrants. Now, let's move on and take a look at the share of migrants by source, basically where they are coming from. Suppose you take those migrants, people staying in a rural area. So you go to rural area, find out the people who are migrants, and try to understand where they are coming from. So if you go to rural area and find out take all the female migrants, you'll find that about 88.8% of the female migrants are actually from some rural area or the other. So they are rural to rural migrants. On the contrary, if you go to urban area and take the female migrants in the urban area, you will see that about 54% of them would have come from some rural areas. That will be rural to urban migrants among the female migrants. Similarly, if you take the scenario of the male migrants, if you go to rural area and identify the male migrants, what you see here is this is an interesting thing. If you take the rural male migrants, you see about 51.6% actually from urban areas. Now this seems to be a little bit of counterintuitive, but let us also understand this survey was conducted amidst the whole post COVID-19 scenario, where actually a lot of workers might have actually come back from urban to rural sector, and they might have said that generally we stay in urban sector, now we are staying in rural sector. So if you take all the rural male migrants, about 51.6% of them would say that they have come from some urban area. Compared to that, if you take the migrants, male migrants in urban areas, you will see about 53.7% from rural area. So here is a striking difference between the urban and rural story for the male migrants. That if you take the rural male migrants, a relatively larger proportion seems to be coming from urban areas. If you take the urban male migrants, a relatively larger proportion seems to be coming from rural areas. Let us also not forget, as we mentioned, this is in a post-COVID scenario. So the situation might change over the time. Okay, and the last box is always where we are ignoring whether we are talking about the male migrants or female migrants. Okay, now let's look at the share of migrants by source region. In the sense, are they coming from the same state or they're coming from some other state or other countries? So if you take, again, here we are also segregating in terms of their gender. If you take all the female migrants in rural area, you can see about 95.8% of them are actually from the same state. So clearly, in case of the rural female migrants, it is predominantly within state migration. That ratio is relatively smaller when you take the urban female migrants, but still, even urban female migrants is also mostly from same state. About 14.9% would be from another state. This scenario changes when you actually consider the male migrants. What you see here, about 62.5%, which is still much higher compared to 33.7%, are actually from the same state. But relatively speaking, the dominance of migration from other state is present relatively more for the male migrants, be it rural sector, be it urban sector. However, in case of urban sector, that ratio, that how many of them are actually coming from the same state, it seems to be a little higher than what we see in case of rural male migrants. Now, another interesting thing, and this is what perhaps interests a lot of you, that why are people migrating? Now, here again, there is a significant gender division. Like male have a different kind of reason, female migrants have different reasons. If you look at the numbers, take a look at the percentage distribution in case of the male migrants. Okay, how many of them are actually migrating in search of employment or better employment? 22.8. Compare that with the female figure, it's 0.6%. For employment, how many are them actually migrating for employment or work or to take up employment or to take up better employment? It's about 20%, roughly 20% of male are actually migrating for that reason. Again, only about 0.7% of female are actually migrating for that reason. So on the whole, what you clearly see that male migration is predominantly driven by economic or other work-related factors. Whereas for the female migration, well, as you might have guessed it already, it is the marriage-related migration. Look at the distribution here. It is about 86.8% of the female migrants are actually migrating or they have migrated because of the marriage purpose. So what we saw so far that there is the patterns of migration and the rate of migration, the source of migration, there is gender-wise differences, and also the reasons also there is a gender-wise differences. There are also sectoral differences. So to understand the story of the scenario of migration in India, we need to keep in mind whether we are talking about male migrants, female migrants, are we talking about the rural migrants or the migrants in rural area, or we are talking about the migrants in urban area. Okay, here is a question for you. What is the main reason behind migration among men and women in India? So we left you with a question, what is the main reason behind migration among men and women in India? As you can understand from the preceding discussion, that most of the male migrants are actually migrating because of job-related reason, and female migration is predominantly a marriage-related migration. Now we come to the third segment of our discussion today. How are migration and population growth related? This is a very interesting thing because let's look at the developed countries who are in their third stage of their demographic transition, low mortality rate, low fertility rate. Now, in case of a situation with low fertility rate, what could actually cause population growth to increase? One of the factors there, and perhaps one of the important factors would be migration. So, with fertility rates falling, the importance of migration in contributing to population growth would be increasing. And that is what we are arguing here. That migration already makes an important contribution to population growth. And if we look at since 1990s, migration has been the primary source of population growth in the developed regions. However, the contribution of migration to population growth or decline, it may vary from regions to regions or from time to time. So here we have a spatio-temporal aspect, that how much population matters for migration may actually vary space to space, place to place, region to region, and over time. So what we are arguing, in Europe, migration will provide only a partial compensation for the expected excess of deaths over births between 2015 and 2050. Well, without migration, however, the population of the developed regions would be smaller by 2050, while the population of developing regions would be larger. Clearly, you can see that there is a spatial difference and also temporal difference. Now, can migration affect, the demographic composition, so to speak? Let's say the age composition. Well, what people have argued is that although immigration often has a rejuvenating effect on the population age structure of the receiving countries where the migrants are actually going, it cannot halt or reverse the long-term process of population aging. So what we are trying to say is it will be important, but can it be that important that it can halt or reverse the whole structure of population aging? Again, in case of the developed nation, this becomes more important. Migration is expected to slow down the aging of populations in developed regions. And also look at this point that migration is projected to reduce old age dependency ratios in the developed regions. Okay, a question for you. Why over the time migration might become an important factor behind population growth? I gave you a question, why over the time migration might become an important factor behind population growth. Remember, we discussed that with fertility rate falling, migration would become important in explaining population growth, especially in the developed regions of the world. So we move on to the last segment of our discussion today. What is the relationship between migration, economic development, and population growth? There is something that we are all accustomed with, the issue of urbanization. We see the urban sectors is sprawling and there are more urbanization happening all around us. And this is kind of likely to happen with economic progress, and this also fuels economic progress. But that may also, invite a lot of migrants. We'll come to that shortly. So what we are trying to argue here is that there is some sort of relationship between urbanization, migration, and population growth. And urbanization is also linked with economic progress. It has already been argued, and there are reports like population projection for India and states 2011-2036, as you can see on the graph, that urban population is likely to increase as a share of total population, which basically means the contribution of rural sector in the total population is likely to decrease over time. And we are seeing a rapid urbanization in post-reform India around us and increasing urban population. So this is not counterintuitive. However, there is an interesting research publication by Niti Aayog with the title Urbanization, which claims the following thing. Contrary to popular perception, migration is not the principal or the dominant factor in urban growth. Let me repeat what I said. Contrary to popular perception, migration is not the principal or dominant factor in urban growth. Remember, now we are talking about India, a developing regions, unlike the developed regions, where migration can become relatively more important in explaining population growth. In Indian context, it is not yet the case. However, in the case of some large cities, such as Mumbai, Delhi, Hyderabad, and Bangalore, for certain periods of time, migration has been a major factor. So while for the overall country, it need not be the case that urban population growth is predominantly or guided by migration, or migration is a major factor for urban population growth. For certain big cities, like the ones we mentioned, Delhi, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Bangalore, in some periods of time, you may find that migration plays some sort of important role in explaining urban population growth. Now, migration and economic development, there is some sort of complex relationship. There is a famous model called Lewis model, where Lewis argues that traditional sectors are filled with mostly surplus labor, and most of the traditional sectors are actually located in the rural sector. And if we relocate this surplus labor to modern sector, which is more productive, what we have here, that we have more surplus generation in the economy, which can be reinvested, as well as we'll have capital accumulation and higher growth. So what is the simple story here? Rural sector is dominated by surplus labor. Some of this surplus labor can migrate to urban sector, get employed in the formal economy, in the factories, and therefore more productive sector, generate more surplus which can be reinvested. There'll be capital accumulation, there'll be growth. A story of economic growth via industrialization mediated by what we can consider as rural to urban migration. However, the matter is a little more complicated than that, as Harris-Todaro model has actually shown us. Now, Harris-Todaro model argues that there is a wage differential between urban and rural sector, which will of course attract a lot of rural people to migrate to urban area. We just said that they can join the more productive sector. But just because some people are migrating from rural to urban sector does not necessarily mean they will find a suitable job in formal economy, or rather they will be formal labor. Many of them may not find a formal sector job, or they may not be formally employed. So what will happen to them? Those who cannot find such jobs, they may either remain unemployed, now that is not viable, In that case, they will try to join the informal labor force, maybe become self-employed or join some sort of informal labor force. Remember, we started our discussion with the post-COVID scenario, what we have seen. These hundreds and thousands of migrant workers returning home. Most of them, if not all of them, are actually informal laborers. So with such rural to urban migration, it does not mean always we'll have labor absorption in formal economy or they'll be employed formally. What we actually also may have is an issue of urban unemployment, urban poverty, and increasing informal labor in urban sector. Also, unequal spatial development might influence migration. It can be locally or internationally. Imagine out of 3-4 regions, if one region is more developed as compared to other regions, from less developed region, a lot of people will try to migrate to more developed region. This we have already seen in the global case, right? We have seen that where are most of these migrants going? To high income countries. And so unequal development and migration are actually linked. And it can be within country, like intrastate, interstate, or it can be international also. So what we are trying to argue is there are economic benefits of migration, but at the same time, migration poses some serious challenges. And with this, we come to the take-home points of our discussion today. Migration is an increasingly important matter, both globally and locally or nationally. We have seen that high-income countries are the major destinations for international migrant workers, and in general also. In India, most female migration is marriage-related, and for most male, migration is for searching like job, looking for better job, or taking up better jobs. So mainly job-related migration. Globally, migration is likely to affect population growth given the fertility rate is declining, but also very specific to certain developed part of the world. In India, it is still not a major factor for population growth, especially for urban population growth. Although for certain big cities, it plays a major role in demographic changes. The link, however, between migration, population growth, and development is not straightforward. Thank you.